Welcome to Lecture Primer number 6 for Social Philosophy, Testimony and Epistemic Authority. When we think about the word testimony, what might spring to mind is testimony in the formal legal sense, where we might mean somebody standing in a court and saying things that they have sworn to be true. However, within epistemology, when people use the word testimony, they're generally using it in a wider epistemological sense, which will of course include that same testimony that is given in court, but will also include other instances of learning things from what other people say or what they express. The key point here is that you are learning something from the representational content, the message of the other person. For example, it doesn't count as testimony if I was speaking in this lecture and my voice was croaky and you learnt from me speaking that I had a bad cold. That wouldn't count as learning from testimony. We're interested in learning whether learning takes place by means of understanding the message that's being conveyed. So as well as legal courts, we might also think then that testimony includes being told things in person by your friends and peers. It includes reading things in books that have been written by people. It includes seeing things on television, watching the news and learning about what's happening across the world. And of course, hopefully, it includes listening to lectures and lecture primer videos and learning something from hearing what your lecturer is saying. As we can see here, the kinds of things we want to count as testimony are very diverse. But in general, we can say, as Jennifer Lackey does, that testimony is a vital and ubiquitous source of knowledge. We rely on the reports of others for our beliefs about the food we eat, the medicine we ingest, the products we buy, the geography of the world, discoveries in science, historical information, and many other areas that play crucial roles in both our practical and our intellectual lives. Were we to refrain from accepting the testimony of others, our lives would be impoverished in startling and deliberating ways. So the idea here is that there are many, many things that we know and that are really important for our lives only by way of testimony. If I think of myself and what I know, I might say, look, almost everything I know about the world before the mid-1980s, when I was born, I know through testimony. The very fact that various countries exist, I only know through testimony. Most scientific facts, I only know through testimony. I haven't gone out there and done the experiments myself. Instead, I've read things and learned them. Even my own name and date of birth. I can't remember being born, and I can't remember the declaration of my name. However, we want to understand the how that social fact comes into being. How I learned of them was people telling me about them. So it seems like there are lots of things that I know through testimony. And if I was to give up on saying that I know these things, my life would be very different. So the role of testimony in knowledge has been very much debated in classical epistemology. So on the one hand, people want to say that lots of things we believe appear to come from testimony, and further, that we seem to be justified in those beliefs. Thus, it's the conclusion you might want to think follows is that testimony should be able to justify our beliefs. However, on the other hand, classical epistemologists have worried that testimony seems worryingly fallible and open to abuse. How do we know that people aren't lying to us? Thus, testimony to doesn't seem like it's quite the strong kind of thing that could justify our beliefs. How do we know from testimony? What's the foundation of our justification for accepting testimony? That's the kind of thing that you might be interested in if you were doing classical epistemological investigation into testimony. The two prominent options are reductionism, where we say, look, the justification you get from testimony comes from some other source, such as the fact that you have, one option would be to say the fact that you have in the past reliably seen that every time somebody said something to you, when you checked, it turned out that was correct, and therefore by induction you can be justified in believing them now because you have confirmed that they were correct in the past. The problem with these reductionist type approaches is when we look into it, people worry about whether we ever have that kind of justification. For instance, if it is about induction, whether actually you have confirmed that most of the things that you know by testimony are true. So, have I really confirmed that all the things that I've been told about stuff that happens before the mid-1990s, my 1980s, is true? The worry is that in order to confirm or deny lots of the things about testimony, a lot of the time I use further testimony. And that pushes people towards a non-reductivist position, which says, look, there's something about just testimony that means you can rely on it just by virtue of being told. In the same way that you might think that you can be justified in believing there's an apple in front of you just by the very nature of having that sense experience. That doesn't mean that the sense experience can't be wrong, but in those cases where it is right, you don't have to have checked for the general reliability of your sense data. You can just rely on it. Okay, so those are the classical arguments about testimony in epistemology. But as social epistemologists in this course, we want to be interested in something slightly different about epistemology. Social epistemologists are interested in a different aspect of testimony. So Smith says in Socializing Epistemology, social epistemology is the conceptual and normative study of the relevance of social relations, roles, interests, and institutions to knowledge. So, in line with the rest of this course, what we're interested in is how what we've called social facts factor into the ways in which we do gain knowledge from testimony, rather than asking foundational questions about exactly whether we do or not. A really important question within this debate is how our social identities affect, firstly, who we trust, whose testimony we are willing to accept and to gain knowledge from, and secondly, the flip side of that coin is whether others trust us. So this issue of being trusted on testimony. Imagine the following scenario. Imagine that your car has broken down and you're standing by the side of the road. Two people pass by and both give you very confidently expressed opinions about the thing that is wrong with your car, that you need to, the bit in the engine that you need to tweak to get your car running again. Person A and person B. Person A is a young woman who is dressed in what might once have been thought of as alternative clothes, who is a white European woman. Let's say person B is an older man who is dressed in casual but not counterculture type clothes. These two people seem to occupy different social locations, And you might think, and thanks to one of the students in a seminar for bringing up this example, you might think, thinking of yourself, and if they've told you two conflicting bits of information that can't both be true about what wants to be tweaked in the engine, that you're more likely to trust one of those than the other. Not wanting to second guess what you've said, but most people, I think, are more likely to go with person B. And maybe this has to do with his social location as an older man. So, we can take this notion of trusting people and think about it in general. So not just trusting this particular person A or this particular person B, but thinking about whether the testimony of people in general who occupy different social locations is believed or not. So when S, who is in one location, testifies that P, is S's testimony that P believed. We might say that if they are likely to be regarded as, if they are likely to be believed, then we can say they have more epistemic authority. So when you have more epistemic authority, then your testimony that P is more likely to be believed. We might think that not having this be the case means that you have a credibility deficit. So we have these two notions. One is having epistemic authority, and one is having a credibility deficit. And the thing that we want to investigate in this lecture is going to be whether our social locations play a systematic role in giving people epistemic authority or credibility deficits. Further, we're going to be looking at whether this constitutes an injustice of some sort. Before we get there, though, I want you to have a think about the following lecture primer questions. Firstly, think of 5 separate things that you would count yourself as knowing by way of testimony. Here, don't worry too much about kind of Descartesian, kind of doubting everything type worries. Assume that your general view about what you know is correct, the general folk view. What things do you generally take yourself to know outside of the philosophical classroom when you're being asked to doubt everything? What things do you generally take yourself as knowing that you think you know by way of testimony? Think of 5 separate things. Secondly, for each of those 5 things, try and identify either the actual particular agents, or if you can't identify the particular agent, the kinds of agents that you've had to trust, i.e. the kinds of agents that you've had to treat as having epistemic authority in order to gain this knowledge. Lastly, I want you to see if you can think of some social roles that come with general assumptions of either epistemic authority or that come with epistemic deficits. Thank you for listening to the lecture primer, and I shall see you in the lecture.